They fired me at 9 in the morning for being too cautious. At 8 minutes past 9, the concrete cracked, sirens screamed, and $50 million of cargo became industrial trash. I never hacked the system or sabotaged anything. I simply smiled, walked out, and gave them what they craved. A machine running at breakneck speed with no brakes. When they realized the truth, bringing me back cost more than any contract they ever signed. Hello to all the wonderful listeners of Boss Revenge Stories. Thank you so much for your continuous support over the years. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently demonetized our channel, leaving us with absolutely no budget to operate. Because of this, we are forced to stop uploading new videos here for the foreseeable future, and we will be moving our operations entirely over to Patreon. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel. There, you can listen to exclusive, true stories that are even more thrilling, featuring much longer runtimes and highly detailed situations that we simply cannot publicize on YouTube, all brought to life by multiple emotional voice actors in a single story. You can easily join us by scanning the QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the Patreon link located in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us begin today's journey into corporate arrogance, where you will step into the mind of our protagonist, Ella Scott. The executive suite of Aegis Freight Dynamics sat suspended above the Seattle harbor like a pristine glass cage, utterly insulated from the deafening mechanical roar of the automated logistics empire below. I was 38 years old, the lead systems engineer who had spent the last 7 years meticulously building the digital nervous system for the largest autonomous freight hub on the West Coast. Outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the city was draped in a freezing, relentless drizzle, but inside the office of Julian Vance, the air felt artificially thin and suffocatingly sterile. Julian, our chief executive officer, paced slowly in front of the glass, his expensive leather shoes completely silent against the imported rug. He was a man deeply obsessed with the flashy aesthetic of corporate disruption, draped in a custom Italian suit that cost more than my first car. Sitting aggressively relaxed in one of the plush leather guest chairs was Troy. Troy was barely in his mid-20s, a fresh Silicon Valley import whose primary qualifications were a designer hoodie, an insufferable habit of chewing bubblegum with his mouth open, and the undeniable fact that his wealthy father played golf with Julian every single weekend. Troy was our newly minted vice president of operations. Ella, Julian began, steepling his perfectly manicured fingers as he turned to face me. Aegis is entering a new era. We need to be lean. We need to be aggressive. And frankly, your department has become a massive bottleneck. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, feeling the cold leather of the chair seeping through my slacks. My department ensures that 1,000-ton steel machines do not collide while moving at high speeds, I replied, my voice entirely devoid of any tremor or defensive heat. The safety protocols exist because the laws of physics demand them. Troy let out a loud pop with his gum, smirking as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Your protocols are ancient history. Ella, you have got the whole grid throttled down to a pathetic crawl. We are losing 12% efficiency on every single loading cycle because your code is too scared of a little wind resistance. True innovation requires risk. Julian nodded solemnly, as if the arrogant kid in the hoodie had just delivered a profound philosophical revelation. Troy is exactly right. You are hindering innovation. Ella, you are too cautious, too heavily burdened by rules, and far too slow for where this company is headed. We are terminating your employment, effective immediately. Julian stepped forward and slid a thin manila folder across the pristine expanse of his mahogany desk. Inside was a standard severance agreement and a compensation check that was insultingly small, barely enough to cover 2 months of rent in the city. Sign it, Julian commanded, his tone instantly dropping the faux-friendly corporate veneer. And we require you to hand over full administrative access to the automated crane dispatch system right now. Troy will be taking over the helm starting today. They expected tears. They expected a fiery, indignant outburst. a desperate plea for my career, or a long-winded, emotional defense of my life's work. Instead, I simply picked up the heavy steel pen resting on the desk. The silence in the room was so absolute that the scratching of the metal nib against the thick paper sounded like a knife scraping against bone. I signed my name with fluid, practiced precision. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice to argue. "The system is yours," I said calmly, closing the folder and pushing it back across the glass surface. I stood up, slowly smoothing the invisible wrinkles from my dark coat. Julian looked visibly disappointed that he did not get the chance to crush my spirit further or assert his dominance in a shouting match. Troy just grinned widely, his eyes already glazed over with greedy visions of shattering operational records and securing a massive year-end bonus. I walked out of the executive suite, my heels clicking methodically against the polished concrete floor of the open-plan engineering deck. I stopped by my workstation one last time. It was a sterile, highly organized desk, wiped clean of any personal photographs or sentimental trinkets years ago. I picked up my leather briefcase, but before I turned away to leave for good, I reached deep into my coat pocket. My fingers brushed against a small, cold, metallic object. I pulled out a bright red USB drive and placed it deliberately in the dead center of my mechanical keyboard. Taped securely to the casing of the drive was a crisp white label with 2 words printed in bold black ink: Master Override. It was not a virus. It was not a malicious piece of sabotage. It was simply a perfectly clean, highly dangerous backdoor access key that instantly stripped away every single safety limit, every speed governor, and every wind shear failsafe I had ever carefully coded into the network. It was the absolute, unbridled freedom they so desperately wanted. It was a flawless piece of bait. I turned my back to the desk and walked straight to the glass elevators at the end of the hall. The doors slid open with a soft, welcoming chime. I stepped inside, pressing the button for the ground floor. As the heavy glass doors began to close, I looked out through the transparent walls of the elevator shaft, gazing directly back at my old desk. Troy had not even waited for my scent to fade from the boardroom. He was already sprinting toward my workstation. Even from a distance, I could see the hungry, frantic gleam in his eyes. He snatched the red USB drive off the keyboard, staring at the label like a starving man looking at a royal feast. He was a creature of shortcuts, a foolish boy eager to play God with colossal machines he fundamentally did not understand. I watched him eagerly slide into my chair and jam the drive directly into the main terminal. The elevator began its smooth descent, plunging me down into the gray, rainy reality of the city streets. Above me, the countdown to hell had already begun. The chill of the Seattle morning bit into my skin the moment I stepped out of the glass lobby. A relentless drizzle coated the pavement in a slick, gray sheen. I pulled my collar up against the damp wind. Reaching into my pocket, I extracted a silver lighter and a single cigarette. I cupped my hands, struck the flint, and inhaled the sharp, burning smoke. I exhaled slowly, watching the gray plume mix with the fog. Then, I raised my left wrist. I stared at the sweeping second hand of my analog watch. The countdown had officially begun. High above me, in the climate-controlled sanctuary of the operations center, the trap was springing shut. I did not need to see Troy to know exactly what he was doing. He was staring at the blinking prompt from the master override. The system was asking for final confirmation to bypass all environmental safety protocols. He did not hesitate. He bypassed the warning. His first target was obvious. He went straight for the balanced payload allocation algorithm. In his dangerously limited mind, that specific block of code was nothing but a nuisance. He believed it was the sole reason the loading docks lagged 12% behind his impossible fantasy targets. With a single, arrogant keystroke, he deleted the algorithm from the active queue. He stripped the digital brakes from the largest moving structures in the state. Minute 3 arrived. The physical world responded to the digital command. Across the sprawling concrete expanse of the harbor, the automated tower cranes woke up. These were colossal, imposing structures of reinforced steel, designed to handle thousands of tons of cargo. Usually, They moved with a calculated, rhythmic grace. Not anymore. The command center pumped maximum power into their drive motors. They jolted forward. They began tracking along their massive rails at maximum velocity. High-velocity wind sheared across the bay, slamming into the suspended steel boxes. The environmental sensors on the crane arms flashed bright red. They screamed for the automated dampeners to engage. They begged the system to slow down and compensate for the heavy wind resistance. The override silenced every single alarm. The cranes ignored the wind. They moved faster. The steel joints began to groan under the sheer, unnatural stress. Minute 5. A sharp vibration echoed against my hip. I reached into my coat and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated the gloomy street corner with a harsh blue light. A text message from Julian had just arrived. I opened it. System running at record speed. You held us back for too long, Ella. The sheer, blinding hubris of the man was almost poetic. They were pushing thousands of tons of volatile cargo through a windstorm with zero inertia limits, and they thought they were winning. I did not type a reply. I did not need to. I simply smiled, pressed the trash icon, and deleted the message. I took another drag of my cigarette. The cherry burned bright red in the mist. 3 minutes left. Inside the terminal, the chaotic momentum was compounding exponentially. Without the load balancing algorithm, the central computer could no longer calculate the swing trajectory of the suspended containers. The cranes were yanking heavy cargo boxes off the transport ships and whipping them through the air with terrifying speed. The physics of inertia began to take over. A loaded container moving at that velocity does not simply stop when the crane stops. It swings. It carries massive, unstoppable kinetic energy. The system was blind to the swinging. The cranes were operating on a purely linear, hyper-accelerated schedule. The safety gaps between the moving steel titans narrowed. The margins of error evaporated completely. Minute 8. The inevitable laws of physics collected their debt. Crane Alpha and Crane Delta were operating on adjacent tracks. They were both swinging massive, fully loaded cargo units toward the central sorting concrete pad. The wind hit them hard from the west. The override forced them to maintain their accelerated collision course. The computer failed to calculate the aggressive sway of the suspended loads. The impact was deafening. It sounded like a bomb detonating in the middle of the harbor. The two colossal steel arms slammed into each other mid-air. The catastrophic kinetic transfer shattered the locking mechanisms instantly. The heavy steel cables snapped with the sharp crack of a colossal whip. Gravity took over. Multiple reinforced containers plummeted from the sky. They were not carrying cheap textiles or raw iron. They were packed to the brim with rare biopharmaceuticals and highly sensitive, next-generation electronic chips. They hit the reinforced concrete yard in a horrific, synchronized freefall. The metal boxes crumpled like tinfoil. The sheer concussive force of the impact sent a shockwave through the ground that I felt through the soles of my shoes. Exactly $50 million evaporated into a toxic cloud of shattered silicon, crushed glass, and vaporized chemicals in less than a second. But the disaster was not finished. The severed steel cables from the broken cranes whipped downward, slicing violently through the primary high-voltage transmission lines powering the sector. A massive shower of blue and white sparks erupted into the rainy sky. The transformers overloaded. A chain reaction of electrical explosions ripped through the facility. Then, darkness. The entire automated freight yard, the control center, and the gleaming glass executive suite plunged into an absolute, dead silence. The power grid had completely short-circuited. I dropped the butt of my cigarette onto the wet pavement and crushed it beneath my heel. The 8 minutes were up. They had their speed. Now, they had their hell. The afternoon settled heavily over the paralyzed harbor. Inside the Aegis Freight Dynamics headquarters, the backup generators had kicked in, bathing the executive suites in an eerie, sickly yellow light. The news of the disaster was locked down immediately. A corporate blackout was declared, severing all outgoing communications from the engineering deck. The silence in the building was no longer sterile. It was the suffocating, heavy quiet of a sinking ship. Julian paced his office, his expensive suit jacket discarded on the floor. his silk tie loosened like a hangman's noose. The sheer financial reality was crashing down on him. The ruined cargo alone was worth exactly $50 million, but the collateral damage to the infrastructure, the shattered cranes, and the inevitable breach of contract penalties would easily quadruple that number. The company was staring down the barrel of immediate, catastrophic bankruptcy. Troy sat in the corner, his previous arrogance entirely evaporated. The Silicon Valley prodigy was pale, his knees bouncing nervously, his hands trembling as he stared at his blank phone screen. He had played God, and he had burned the entire logistics empire down. "We need a narrative," Julian snapped, turning on his heel to glare at Troy. "If the board finds out you bypassed the safety protocols, we are both going to federal prison for corporate negligence. We need a scapegoat." Julian picked up his desk phone and summoned the head of Internal Information Technology. When the nervous director arrived, Julian did not mince words. He ordered the team to completely fabricate the central server logs. The directive was simple and ruthless. Scrub every single trace of Troy's master override command and replace it with a digital ghost. They were to construct a fake narrative proving that a malicious revenge malware had been planted in the system. They were going to frame me for the disaster. They would claim I had coded a sleeper virus designed to overload the crane limits the moment my employment was terminated. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the forged logs were being finalized. I knew this because my phone chimed softly with an incoming email notification. I was sitting in the back corner of a nameless, dimly lit coffee shop on the edge of the financial district. The air smelled of roasted beans and damp wool. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso, savoring the bitter warmth, and opened the message. It was a formal, highly aggressive notice of impending legal action, forwarded from Julian's legal team, citing an active investigation by the Federal Automated Logistics Bureau. The email threatened me with criminal charges for cyber terrorism and industrial sabotage. They claimed the Bureau had seized the server logs and had definitive proof of my guilt. They were trying to scare me into a panic. They wanted me to hire a cheap lawyer and beg for a settlement where I would take the fall to avoid jail time. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I felt a profound, cold sense of satisfaction. I set my ceramic cup down and unlatched my heavy leather briefcase. I pulled out my personal laptop, a thick, matte black machine protected by military-grade encryption and biometric locks. I pressed my thumb against the scanner. The screen flared to life, casting a pale glow across my face in the dim cafe. I had spent 7 years observing the cutthroat, viper pit mentality of corporate executives. I knew Julian would never take responsibility for his own failures, and I knew Troy was too much of a coward to own his disastrous mistakes. I had anticipated their dirty tactics long before I ever walked into that boardroom this morning. They thought they controlled the narrative because they controlled the physical servers in their building. They were completely oblivious to the real architecture of the network I had built. Months ago, anticipating a hostile exit, I had silently routed a shadow copy of the system's operational telemetry. Every single keystroke, every command, every bypassed safety warning, and every environmental sensor reading was being actively mirrored, but it was not being saved to a hard drive. They could wipe. The real system activity from the exact moment I was fired was being continuously encrypted and broadcasted to a decentralized blockchain ledger. It was a distributed, uneditable digital vault scattered across thousands of independent nodes worldwide. Even if Julian burned the Aegis headquarters to the ground, he could never alter a single line of that immutable truth. The blockchain held the pristine, undeniable record of Troy initiating the master override and ignoring the wind shear warnings. But my trap was far more sophisticated than a simple backup. On my screen, a series of complex data packets began to flash green. I smiled, resting my chin on my hand. Back in the Aegis server room, the frantic IT team was currently attempting to delete the genuine administrative logs to cover Troy's tracks. They had no idea that they were walking straight into a digital minefield. The central server's core logging system was deeply intertwined with a passive defense mechanism I had designed years ago to prevent external hacking. It operated on a very simple principle. If anyone attempted to forcibly alter or delete the root operational history without the proper biometric clearance, the system would immediately classify it as a critical security breach. By trying to erase the truth, Troy and Julian's IT team were not saving themselves. They were unwittingly arming the very weapon that would destroy them. Every fake log they compiled, every genuine record they tried to scrub, was quietly locking them deeper inside a cage of their own making. The walls were closing in on the executive suite, and they could not even see the bars. Back in the suffocating twilight of the executive suite, the atmosphere had deteriorated from frantic, misdirected action into an absolute, paralyzing dread. The director of information technology, a man who had looked merely stressed a few hours ago, now looked entirely broken as he stood before Julian's mahogany desk. His crisp white shirt was heavily soaked in cold sweat, clinging awkwardly to his shoulders. He held a sleek tablet in his violently shaking hands, struggling to find the exact words that would inevitably destroy his career and shatter his boss's fragile reality. Julian demanded the immediate status of the forged logs, his voice cracking like a whip in the dim, generator-lit room. He needed the scapegoat narrative finalized, polished, and ready for the crisis management team. The IT director swallowed hard, his throat dry, and finally admitted the catastrophic truth. There was no malware. There was no vindictive revenge virus hidden in the architecture to take the blame for the $50 million disaster outside. Instead, by attempting to tamper with the root directory to erase Troy's commands, the internal security team had blindly sprinted into a solid titanium digital wall. They had unknowingly triggered a highly aggressive, deeply entrenched dead man's switch. Julian, his face turning an unhealthy shade of pale, demanded to know exactly what that meant. The explanation delivered by the trembling engineer was nothing short of a corporate death sentence. The core server, containing the absolute, unedited truth of the day's events, was now locked inside an impenetrable biometric holding pattern. It had isolated itself from the local network entirely. If I did not physically authenticate my unique biometric signature, my retinal scan and fingerprints, on the primary mainframe every 24 hours, the system would automatically execute a mass distribution protocol. It would completely bypass their internal firewalls, using a dormant, hardwired satellite uplink I had quietly installed under the guise of an emergency redundancy system years ago. Once the timer hit 0, it would broadcast the raw, undisputed operational logs directly to the Federal Automated Logistics Bureau, every major national news syndicate, and the 3 massive insurance conglomerates that underwrote the harbor. The realization hit Julian like a physical blow to the chest. The fabricated story they had spent the entire afternoon painstakingly building was utterly useless. The fake logs were trapped on a localized server, while the real evidence of their monumental negligence was essentially strapped to a digital bomb, ticking down relentlessly in the dark. He was completely cornered, trapped in a cage of his own arrogance. Miles away, my phone began to vibrate softly on the scarred wooden table of the cafe. The caller identification simply displayed a private number, but I knew exactly who was frantically dialing on the other end. I did not pick it up immediately. I let it ring. 1, 2, 3, 4 times. I let the psychological weight of the ringing silence press down on him, letting his panic steep and multiply with every passing second. Finally, on the 5th ring, I picked up the device and brought it to my ear, remaining absolutely silent. Ella. Julian breathed into the receiver. The polished, commanding baritone he always used to dominate boardrooms and intimidate shareholders was completely gone. In its place was a ragged, trembling hiss of powerless rage and pure desperation. The sound of his rapid, shallow breathing filled the receiver. He sounded like a man watching his empire burn to the ground, realizing the flames were already licking at his own expensive shoes. "You arrogant, vindictive witch, what have you done? You are holding proprietary corporate data hostage. This is a federal crime. I will have my lawyers tear you apart. I will have you locked in a concrete cell for the rest of your miserable life." I leaned back in my wooden chair, staring out the cafe window at the gray, rain-slicked streets of the city. The contrast between his frantic, chaotic hysteria and my absolute, chilling stillness was profoundly intoxicating. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the silence on the line stretch out just long enough to let him realize that his threats meant absolutely nothing to me. "I am not holding data hostage, Julian," I replied, my voice as cold and flat as a slab of polished marble. "I am simply protecting the truth from liars. You and your golden boy decided you did not need the safety protocols. You decided my expertise and caution were a hindrance to your precious innovation. Now, you are experiencing exactly what your version of innovation looks like in the real world." "You set us up!" he screamed, his voice breaking violently on the last word. I could clearly hear the sound of heavy glass shattering in the background, likely a crystal whiskey tumbler he had hurled against the immaculate walls of his office. "You left that red drive on your desk on purpose. You knew Troy would take it. You planned this whole disaster." "I left a diagnostic tool on a desk," I corrected him, my tone completely devoid of any emotion or defensive posture. "Troy chose to steal it. Troy chose to plug it into the mainframe. Troy chose to manually bypass 7 distinct warning prompts, each one explicitly telling him that disabling the load balance algorithms during a high wind event would result in catastrophic structural failure. I did not force his hand. I merely handed a loaded weapon to a foolish child, and the child pulled the trigger exactly as his arrogant nature dictated. He tried to interrupt, sputtering wildly about corporate espionage and blackmail, but I cut him off. My voice hardened, dropping an octave, carrying the absolute authority of someone who held every single winning card in the deck. "Listen to me very carefully, Julian, because I will only say this one time. You have exactly one way out of this nightmare without wearing an orange jumpsuit. You are going to open your email client right now. You are going to write a full, unredacted confession addressed directly to the board of directors. In this document, you will detail exactly how you authorized Troy to bypass the critical safety systems to chase an impossible, fictitious quota. You will take full, unwavering responsibility for the $50 million lying in ruins on the tarmac, and you will immediately officially strip Troy of his vice president title and revoke his physical and digital access to every single Aegis facility across the country." "You are completely out of your mind," he gasped, literally choking on his own rising panic. "The board will crucify me. They will strip my equity, cancel my stock options, and fire me before lunchtime. I will lose everything I have built." "You have already lost everything," I stated simply, dissecting his reality with surgical precision. "The only choice you have left is whether you lose your job or your job and your freedom. The dead man's switch is counting down as we speak. If I do not receive a blind copy of that confessed email, sent directly from your official corporate account, by exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, the truth bomb will detonate. The Bureau will have the unedited logs. The insurance companies will immediately void your coverage due to gross, documented negligence. Aegis will face total liquidation, and you will face a federal judge with no shield to hide behind." "You do not know who you are messing with, Ella," Julian growled, attempting a pathetic, last-ditch stand. He was digging deep into his reservoir of hollow power, trying desperately to sound dangerous. "I have deep connections. I have powerful friends in the district attorney's office and on Capitol Hill. I can make you disappear from this industry forever. I will bury you so deep you will never see a computer screen again." I did not laugh. I did not mock his desperate posturing. I simply delivered the final, fatal blow to his crumbling ego. Tick-tock, Julian, 8 o'clock in the morning. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, severing the connection instantly. I placed the phone face down on the table, leaving him screaming his empty threats into the silent, uncaring void of a dead line. The power dynamic had completely, irreversibly shifted. He was the chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar logistics empire, sitting in a glass tower, surrounded by immense wealth and superficial influence. Yet, he was entirely, hopelessly at the mercy of an unemployed engineer sitting in a cheap coffee shop, sipping lukewarm espresso. The trap was permanently locked. Now, all I had to do was sit back and wait for the king to hang himself. Night descended upon the city, but the Aegis headquarters remained a fortress of suffocating panic. in the dimly lit corridors of the executive floor, the fragile alliance between the conspirators completely shattered. Troy, the arrogant 20-something prodigy, finally grasped the terrifying reality of his situation. He was not a valued partner in innovation. He was the perfect, expendable scapegoat. He had seen the way Julian looked at him when the IT director delivered the news of the biometric lock. If Julian could not successfully frame me for the disaster, he was absolutely going to serve Troy on a silver platter to the federal authorities to save his own skin. Consumed by sheer terror, Troy decided to run. He quietly packed his designer backpack, stuffing it with his personal laptop, a few encrypted hard drives, and his passport. He planned to slip out through the underground parking garage, get into his sports car, and drive straight across the state line before dawn. He crept through the silent shadows of the basement level, his breath hitching with every careful step. But as he reached for the cold steel handle of the heavy fire exit door, two massive corporate security guards stepped out from the gloom. Their faces were impassive, their arms firmly crossed. Julian had anticipated the boys' cowardice. The building was under a strict, unofficial lockdown. Troy was physically escorted back to a windowless holding room on the second floor, his phone confiscated, left alone to marinate in his own impending doom. Upstairs, Julian was rapidly losing his grip on sanity. The walls of his glass empire were closing in, and in a fit of delusional rage, he decided to play what he believed was his final, devastating trump card. At 2 o'clock in the morning, my secure messaging app pinged with a lengthy, unhinged voice note from him. "You think you have won this game, Ella?" Julian spat into his microphone, his voice dripping with venom and utter desperation. "Even if I go down today, I am taking you with me. I have the entire board in my pocket. I have the deepest industry contacts on the West Coast. By tomorrow afternoon, I will have your name blacklisted across the entire United States. I will brand you as a rogue engineer, a bitter corporate terrorist. You will never write a single line of code for any tech firm, any logistics hub, or any startup in this country ever again. I will absolutely destroy your professional life." I sat in the quiet comfort of my apartment, the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminating my features. I listened to his pathetic rant twice. He was attempting to use the illusion of power against someone who held the actual keys to the kingdom. I did not reply with anger. I did not type a single word of defense or justification. I simply opened a hidden folder on my encrypted drive and attached a small, highly compressed audio file. I hit send. Back in his ruined office, Julian saw the notification. He clicked the file eagerly, expecting a tearful plea for mercy or a desperate counter-negotiation. Instead, his own voice echoed out from the phone speakers, crisp and undeniably clear. "To hell with the safety protocols. Troy, just wipe every single trace of Ella out of the system for me. We are moving forward today." The silence that followed in his office was absolutely deafening. During that fateful meeting when he fired me, he had been so intoxicated by his own sweeping authority that he completely forgot I was wearing a high-end smartwatch. I had activated the ambient recording function the second I stepped into his office. He had literally ordered the destruction of the safety protocols on tape. His grand threat of ruining my reputation instantly turned to ash in his mouth. I had the undeniable concrete proof of his direct complicity. But the universe was not finished punishing Julian Vance. The greatest blow of the night did not even come from me. At exactly 4 o'clock in the morning, Julian's private, highly secure mobile phone rang. It was a restricted line that only 3 people in the world had the number to, and none of them ever called to share good news. He stared at the caller identification with wide, bloodshot eyes. It was the chairman of the board of directors. Julian answered, his voice barely a terrified whisper. He expected the chairman to ask about a strange localized power outage. He was completely unprepared for the ruthless reality of modern high-frequency trading. The board already knew everything. They did not know because I had leaked the system logs. They knew because the omniscient, unforgiving algorithms of Wall Street had detected a massive, sudden paralysis in the Pacific supply chain. Dozens of massive transport ships were suddenly anchored off the coast, reporting zero movement from the Aegis terminal. Major overseas investors had started making frantic phone calls to the chairman at midnight, demanding to know why a hub responsible for billions of dollars in daily global trade had suddenly gone completely dark. The financial hemorrhage was already public knowledge in the upper echelons of the market. The chairman was screaming so loudly through the receiver that Julian had to hold the phone away from his ear. The board was demanding a full explanation, and they were demanding it immediately. The illusion of control was entirely shattered. Julian had spent the entire night fighting a digital ghost in the machine, completely unaware that the real world had already caught fire outside his window. The digital clock on his wall ticked forward relentlessly. It was 7:50 in the morning. Just 10 minutes remained until my deadline. Julian Vance, the untouchable titan of industry, collapsed heavily into his leather chair. He was a broken, empty shell of a man. His expensive suit was violently wrinkled, his hair was a chaotic mess, and his hands trembled uncontrollably as he pulled his keyboard closer. He opened his official corporate email client. He did not try to negotiate. He did not try to soften the blow. With tears of absolute defeat stinging his eyes, he typed out his own professional obituary. He explicitly confessed to authorizing the manual override. He confessed to the gross negligence that caused the $50 million disaster. He officially terminated Troy from all corporate duties. He signed his name at the bottom, permanently stripping away his own career, his unvested equity, and his legacy. Han hit the send button. Miles away, my laptop chimed with a gentle notification. I opened the email, reading his unconditional surrender word for word. I closed the screen and picked up my delicate porcelain cup. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my warm tea. I turned my chair toward the large window and smiled broadly, watching the golden light of the dawn break beautifully over the Seattle skyline. The brutal battle was over. I had completely dismantled a king and his empire, and I had won the war without ever having to run a single step. The atmosphere inside the Aegis Freight Dynamics boardroom was no longer one of sterile arrogance. When I pushed open the heavy oak doors later that morning, the air was thick with the scent of stale sweat and absolute submission. The entire board of directors, a collection of the wealthiest and most ruthless logistics magnates on the West Coast, sat around the massive glass table in completely awed silence. The two seats at the head of the table were strikingly empty. By 9 o'clock, Julian had been publicly escorted out of the glass lobby in steel handcuffs by federal economic police, his face shielded by a rumpled jacket. Troy, the arrogant golden boy, was currently sitting in a windowless interrogation room downtown, weeping uncontrollably while agents from the Federal Automated Logistics Bureau dissected his ruined life. I stood at the end of the long table, wearing the exact same dark coat I had been fired in 24 hours earlier. I did not sit down. The chairman of the board, an elderly billionaire who usually commanded rooms with a single glance, looked at me with the desperate, hollow eyes of a drowning man. His hands trembled slightly as he pushed a thick, leather-bound folder across the gleaming glass surface toward me. I looked down at it. It was an ironclad executive contract. The title printed at the top read, Chief Executive Officer. Attached to the back was a compensation package that included a staggering amount of corporate equity, signing bonuses, and total, unquestioned operational control. Ella, the chairman rasped, his voice gravelly and stripped of all pride. The system is entirely paralyzed. The insurance underwriters are threatening to pull our coverage by noon. The harbor is dead in the water. We are bleeding tens of millions of dollars every single hour. Please, we need you to take the helm. We need you to fix this. I did not touch the folder. Instead, I turned my back to the billionaires and walked calmly towards the primary master control terminal built into the wall of the boardroom. The massive screens above us were flashing aggressive red error codes, locked in the unyielding grip of my biometric defense system. I stepped up to the console. The room behind me held its collective breath. I placed my right thumb onto the cold glass of the scanner. A soft, welcoming chime echoed through the silent room. A command line terminal materialized on the central screen. My fingers danced across the mechanical keyboard. I did not need to rewrite the entire network. I only needed to input 3 specific lines of code to disarm the dead man's switch and force a hard reboot of the fundamental safety architecture. I hit the enter key. Instantly, the suffocating red glow illuminating the boardroom vanished. The massive digital maps of the Seattle harbor flickered, then shifted to a calm, steady green, deep beneath our feet. The heavy mechanical hum of the central servers roared back to life. Out in the freezing rain, the surviving automated tower cranes slowly reset their positions. They engaged their wind shear dampeners. They locked onto their payloads with calculated, flawless precision. The colossal machine of Aegis Freight Dynamics was running again. It was moving slowly, cautiously, but absolutely perfectly. The collective sigh of relief from the board of directors was audible. The chairman practically slumped in his chair, a weak smile forming on his pale face. He gestured toward the leather folder containing the chief executive officer contract. "Welcome back to the company, Ella. The corner office is yours." I walked slowly back to the glass table. I picked up the heavy leather folder. I looked at the incredible wealth and power offered within those pages. Then, maintaining direct eye contact with the chairman, I ripped the thick contract perfectly in half. The sound of tearing paper echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. The chairman's weak smile instantly vanished, replaced by sheer shock. I tossed the torn pieces into the metal wastebasket, sitting beside his expensive leather shoes. "I do not work for people who consider safety a burden," I said, my voice carrying the unshakable weight of absolute conviction. "You wanted a machine with no brakes, and you paid $50 million for the privilege of seeing it crash. Find someone else to clean up the blood." I turned on my heel and walked out of the glass boardroom for the last time. I strode through the executive lobby, stepped into the elevator, and rode it down to the ground floor, keeping my head held high. I never looked back. A few months later, I officially founded Scott Predictive Analytics. We became the most exclusive cybersecurity and risk management consulting firm in the United States. Today, the very same corporate titans who used to complain about my cautious methods now form a line around the block, willingly paying millions of dollars just for an hour of my time to ensure their empires do not burn to the ground. In a world always obsessing over speed, they forget that the ultimate winner is not the one who runs the fastest, but the one who knows exactly when the cliff will appear. Slowness was never my weakness. It was my ultimate weapon. Thank you so much to every single one of you for listening to this story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know your city or country in the comments section below. As a reminder, if you found today's journey compelling, our channel is unfortunately no longer able to upload new videos here on YouTube in the foreseeable future due to demonetization, and we are transitioning our entire operation over to Patreon. Please help us keep these stories alive by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel. Over there, you can listen to the absolute best, highly detailed, exclusive true stories that we simply cannot publicize on YouTube. You can join our community right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link provided in the video description or the pinned comment. Thank you again, and stay safe out there.